the Dagmar, this is how the Dagmar Westberg Universitätsfonds came into being in 2010. It was established to encourage research on everything to do with British literature, culture, history at the Goethe-Universität in Frankfurt. Now, we award our prize, the Dagmar Westberg Universitätspreis, either for an excellent MA thesis in British studies throughout the humanities, or for some other excellent project in the field. This time, the committee has decided to use our funds to support the research to be carried out by Dr. Ulrike Kern, who I believe is now with us. Ulrike Kern is an art historian. She's working on cultural interactions in the world of art, cultural connections that took place between England and the continent from the late 16th to the early 18th century. This will be part of what in Germany is known as the Habilitationsprojekt. So this will be part of a postdoctoral degree. And in order to be able to do this, she needs to do a research trip to Britain to look at material that can only be found in archives there. We are, of course, very much interested in cultural connections between Britain and the continent. So the committee came to the conclusion that Dr. Kern's project makes a lot of sense. And therefore, it gives me great pleasure to award this year's Dagmar Westberg Prize to Dr. Kern. We do so in memory of Dagmar Westberg. The fruits of her generosity will remain with us, and that is something we will always be grateful for. So, Frau Kern, congratulations. I can't see Frau Kern. Maybe, Michael, if you could unmute her. Oh, she's already unmuted. Excellent. Unmuted. Excellent. Yeah. She's speaking, but I can't hear her.
We can't hear you, yeah.
But she's clearly happy, and that's the main thing.
Smiling broadly, I guess.
Smiling,
absolutely.
Yeah. If I can.
Technically stressed.
Technically stressed?
Technologically.
Ah, I can hear you now.
Does it work now?
Yes,
yeah.
over to you.
Then without the headset.
Yeah.
Well, let me express, I really want to express my firm gratitude for this support for this trip, which I had to delay because of COVID and Brexit, basically, and really, it will really help me to finish this project, which I'm very keen on doing now. And I feel very privileged that I could get this funding and this award, really. So thank you very much for the
Once you will have finished your project, could we kindly ask you to present this to our members and friends, perhaps in 24?
Yeah.
Next year?
Yeah.
Next year? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
I can promise you that I will keep this in mind and contact you in time.
That's all well. Yeah.
Excellent idea. So excellent congratulations idea. And thank you from me as well, Frau Dr. Kern.
Thank you very much.
Right, excellent. So congratulations once again. And now on to tonight's guest speaker. Dr. Elena Woodacre is a reader in Renaissance history at the University of Winchester. Her field is royal studies, and she is especially interested in the role of queens. In other words, questions of gender and power at the very top of the social hierarchy. She has published extensively in the field of royal studies. She's organizer of a Kings and Queens conference series. She is the founder of the Royal Studies Network and the editor-in-chief of the Royal Studies Journal. And this means that she has actually been instrumental in establishing this field, in putting it on the map by attracting the next generation of scholars to it. And therefore, her work will certainly have a long-term effect. the role that has been played by queens. Now, this is much more than just an academic question. It's much more than just a minority interest pursued by researchers who, well, because they happen to be working on this. It was, of course, the passing of Queen Elizabeth II that made the general public think about this topic. What is queenship all about? And you will not be surprised to learn that although our guest speaker is an historian, she has been much in demand to comment on current affairs. Tonight, Dr. Woodacre is going to present us with a long historical perspective from the 16th century to the present. Dr. Woodacre, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you all tonight. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and hope the technology is all behaving itself. And hopefully, if it is, you can see my slides now. So I'm hoping that you can. Excellent. Wonderful. So what we're going to be talking about tonight, again, is the role of regnant queens, or reigning queens, if you like, in shaping Britain's monarchy. And yes, very much taking with it, I thought perhaps this empty throne of Elizabeth II is really the jumping off point here to think about, the last regnant queen who has had such an indelible impact on the modern monarchy, but going backwards to the very beginning of the tradition of regnant queens. So I'm going to start by thinking about the establishment of female rule, the first regnant queens, and how they kind of broke that path that led to Queen Elizabeth II. I'm going to be thinking about the challenges of being a married regnant queen, or choosing perhaps not to marry in the case of Elizabeth I. So I'm going to be thinking about the difficulties of choosing the right husband and what the role of the male consort is. I'll be thinking about the role of the regnant queens of Britain in shaping the constitutional monarchy and shaping the modern monarchy itself. So over the course of this talk, all of the regnant queens of England and Scotland, of Britain, will be discussed in various different ways. So I'm going to start with the establishment of female rule. And actually, that is the question that got me into queenship studies. That's how I started studying queens, is that I was really interested in how a woman comes to the throne. How is female succession possible? How is it, in what is arguably a patriarchal framework of authority that monarchy generally, not always, but generally is, how is it that a woman comes to wear a crown? And that's what got me interested in queenship studies. That's what kind of led me down the path to where I am today. So I thought, this is the right place to start. Plus, we need to think about the tradition that Elizabeth II was arguably the inheritor of. So I want to start for a minute by going beyond Britain, because obviously, we are looking at this particular case study, but it's important to recognize that regnant queenship, female rule, if you like, has a much broader tradition. So we're going to be thinking about, again, one particular nation's history of regnant queenship, but it's important to recognize that we have reigning queens in every continent, in every era, if you like, of history. And this is something I've written more broadly about in my considerations of kind of global queenship and queenship more broadly. And that's what's exciting to think about, is that it's something that happened across time and space. Almost all areas of Europe experienced female rule over the course of the Middle Ages. And it isn't just, again, a European thing. We see, regnant queens in Egypt, in the Byzantine Empire, in China, Korea, Japan, India, Arwa of Yemen, etc. So this is a phenomenon that goes far beyond England. And I think that it's important, because we tend to sometimes think of England or Britain as being this kind of exceptional study, of this exceptional situation where we've had so many regnant queens. And in some ways it is, but it actually was a bit late off the mark in comparison to some of its counterparts. And some places, which now currently don't allow female succession, like Japan, once did have its own tradition of regnant empresses in what we would call the early Middle Ages. Ooh. There we go. Okay. So when I started looking at female succession, when I started to consider how does a woman come to the throne, over the course of my research, looking at it more broadly and looking at the case studies that I looked at in my master's and my PhD, which was specifically the 12th century and the Queens of Jerusalem in my master's work. And then in my PhD work, I looked at the situation of the regnant queens of Navarre, another nation like Britain, which had a kind of glut, if you like, of regnant queens. And I broke it down to two kinds of factors that are really important: structural factors and situational factors. So I'm going to explain a little bit what I mean by that. So structural factors are law and custom. So you need laws that allow for women to succeed to the throne, or at the very least, offer the possibility for women to inherit lands from their fathers. That can be an opening of a door. The bare minimum is that you at least don't want a law that prevents it from happening. So there needs to be an open door there, either something that specifically says a woman can succeed, or at least there's an opportunity to kind of finagle it, if that makes sense. And what also helps is if it's more important to have the person who is closest in blood relationship to the previous monarch than whether they're male or female. Now, one thing we're going to be thinking a lot about in just a second is the importance of precedent. How important it is to have that once that ball starts rolling, once you start to develop a tradition of female rulership, that really helps the women that follow. So Elizabeth II is building on that momentum, if you like, from these literally centuries of queens that preceded her. We're going to think about how hard it is to be the first in just a second. But as I mentioned, with Japan is a great example of how precedent's not a guarantee that that's going to continue, that the regnant empresses of the early Middle Ages, and even the two that they had in what we would call the early modern period, didn't provide a tradition that endured. And again, today in the 21st century, a woman cannot inherit the chrysanthemum throne as things currently stand. That is a still live debate. Now, what do I mean by situational factors? This is another thing that's really important. It's thinking about what's happening that might kind of help or hinder a woman come to the throne. So again, politics, sometimes a turbulent political situation can provide an opportunity for a woman to inherit. Sometimes it can prevent it as well. But a huge, huge thing in situational factors is what's going on with the dynastic situation, a lack of heirs. And it's important to recognize that women generally are second choice successors. Generally, if there is a brother or a closer male heir in front of them, they will not usually be chosen over that person. I say not usually because there is a situation in what we would call medieval India where a woman, Razia Sultan, was supposedly chosen over her brothers because her father felt she was more fit to rule. Generally, though, you need your brothers to not exist or die in order for you to come to the throne if you are a princess or an heiress, if a potential heiress, rather. So again, death can be an opportunity for women in that case. Now, obviously, male relatives can be stiff competition, uncles and cousins in particular, but female relatives can be an issue too. In the 15th century, there was the War of the Castilian Succession between the woman who became Isabel I, or Isabel la Católica of Castile, and her niece, Juana, who was called La Beltranella, because a lot of people believe that she was actually not the daughter of Isabel's brother, Enrique IV, but that's the daughter of Beltrán de la Cueva, his great favorite, who some believe was the Queen's lover. Okay, so let's pull the situation back to Britain and think about that. Now, obviously, female succession actually has a very shaky start in Britain. Now, more recently, some people have been looking at the early Middle Ages and looking at the situation of Ethelfled, Lady of Mercia. And she has attracted a lot of attention recently in both academia and in popular culture. If any of you have seen The Last Kingdom, and again, my colleague, Professor Ryan Lavelle, was the historical consultant on The Last Kingdom. I don't know if that's made it over to Germany, but it was a big hit in America and here. And again, Ethelfled is an important character in that, Lady of Mercia. So she's been getting a lot of kind of consideration lately. And some people have even said, can we think of her as kind of an early regnant queen, sort of? Again, she's not really, again, setting a precedent, unfortunately, but she is a really interesting case study. Now, the real test case, if you like, for female succession in medieval England was the Empress Matilda. So obviously the Empress Matilda is called the Empress because she was a Holy Roman Empress. She was the wife of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry in her youth. She, after being widowed, still quite young, came back to England, and the death of her brother in the so-called White Ship accident, where, again, there was a terrible sinking of a ship that was carrying the only legitimate male heir of her father, Henry I, made the opportunity, that tragedy creating opportunity for the Empress Matilda. Now, Henry I names her, officially designates her as his heir. He is very keen to establish her very firmly as her heir. He requires the barons of the realm multiple times to assemble and publicly swear oaths to uphold her as his heir when he dies. But in spite of all of that, when Henry I does finally die, unfortunately, Matilda is across the channel. She is not in England at the time. She is in France with her second husband, Geoffrey of Anjou. She is has had a difficult pregnancy. Her health has been poor. She's unable to physically make it to England very quickly. And her cousin, Stephen of Blois, takes advantage of this opportunity, if you like. He gets help from his brother, Henry, the Bishop of Winchester here. At this time, Winchester is one of the key kind of mints, if you like, a key kind of center of power. He uses that to get the support of his brother to come over here and basically, get a head start over Matilda, stake his own claim to the throne, and get himself crowned before Matilda can get here to challenge him. This leads to a long period of civil war, sometimes known as the Anarchy here in England. And Matilda, unfortunately, comes very close at one point. At one point, she holds London. She's preparing her coronation. She's being acknowledged as Lady of the English, but unfortunately falls out with the Londoners, is driven out of the capital, and is never able to completely cement her position as a legally recognized by the entire populace a regnant queen. And this creates kind of a negative precedent that we kind of tried to have female succession and it failed. Now, it's still technically possible in the Middle Ages. It's still technically possible. There is one brief period when female claimants and female line claimants are barred very briefly, but that is undone. And technically, in theory, Elizabeth of York, the wife of the first Tudor monarch, Henry VII, had a better claim to the throne, was much closer in blood to a king, if you like, than her husband, Henry VII. Henry VII knew he needed to marry Elizabeth of York in order to prevent her from either staking her own claim or her husband for staking a claim for her if she married anyone else. But he very savvily made sure he was crowned before he married her, and didn't crown her until she produced an heir, Arthur, who was born here at Winchester and christened here at Winchester. So this was this was his way of saying, I'm not relying on my wife's claim, that I have my own right to be a king. But again, I think technically, if you ask me, I think Elizabeth of York was in a better position there. Now, actually, Scotland in some ways could be seen as being the kind of first to have regnant queens in Britain. Technically, they had a young queen, Margaret, the so-called Maid of Norway, who was designated as the queen. She was, again, by blood right, if you like, she was designated, but she was a child. And unfortunately, she died before she could even come to Scotland to physically claim her throne, but some still acknowledge her as kind of Scotland's first regnant queen. But Mary, Queen of Scots, of course, was definitely a regnant queen in Scotland. Now, one with a very turbulent history, which we can we'll get into a little bit later. But in some ways, we can see her as being kind of ahead of her Tudor cousins in the 16th century, a period when, as we're about to get into, is a real kind of high point in some ways for regnant queenship in Britain. Okay, so we have the beginnings of the establishment, of the firmer establishment of a tradition of regnant queenship here. Now, the big question is, do we count Lady Jane Grey? Now, one of my former PhD students, Dr. Nicola Tallis, has written a number of excellent books, which you can find in many bookstores, Waterstones, Amazon, etc. And she wrote an excellent book on Lady Jane Grey, Crown of Blood. And again, if Nicola was in the room, Nicola would be saying, hang on a minute, we've got to count Lady Jane Grey as the first queen. Not everyone does, because she wasn't crowned, she wasn't anointed. Do we count her? Do we not count her as the beginning? It's difficult. And again, some have said she was, she was an important person. We need to not discount her as a victim or a puppet of those around her, but actually our first regnant queen. I think in some ways we really need to give Mary that acknowledgement. It is Mary who is the first crowned and anointed Queen of England. It is Mary who promulgates the Act Concerning Regal Power. It is that document that firmly establishes what is the role of the female sovereign, what is her powers and prerogatives, and establishes that she is the sovereign, not her husband, not anyone else. She is the sovereign. That's important vis-a-vis her husband, which we'll talk about later on. So that is vital for setting the foundation for every woman who comes after her. So I think we really do need to give Mary more credit. So often we think about Elizabeth, Elizabeth, Elizabeth. And I've literally spent the last 2 days in London at a symposium, which has been talking about an educational treatise, The Education of a Christian Woman, that was written by Juan-Luis Vives, commissioned by her mother, Catherine of Aragon, for the education of Mary as heir apparent, as a woman, as an heir apparent as well. And I think, again, Mary is all too often, overshadowed by her longer reigning sister. And I have another PhD student who's finished, Dr. Joanna Strong, who has written an incredible thesis on how the negative memory of Mary as this kind of bloody Mary, as this negative kind of counterpart to her golden sister, Elizabeth I, how that legend started, if you like, from Mary's death onwards. And it's a really interesting unpicking of how Mary's legacy has been minimized and diminished. And I think it's only now today that we're really starting to give her the credit that is due to her for really establishing this long-standing tradition of female rule in Britain. So why now? Why is it the 16th century these women, whether we're counting Jane or Mary as the first, are able to establish female rule where the Empress Matilda failed? And it's the situational factors. It's the lack of male heirs, lack of alternative male heirs. At this point, from 1553 onwards, the direct heirs were all female. And there's a reason for that. One is the aftermath of the Wars of the Roses, obviously decimated a lot of the kind of what used to be the remnants of the Plantagenet family. After that, Henry VII and Henry VIII's programs of political persecution wiped out a lot of those collateral branches and potential male heirs. So we do get to a point where all of a sudden women are kind of the only ones left standing. And so we have this kind of plethora by a combination of luck and birth order survival, and also, again, the legacy of this persecution that means that it is only women that are kind of in the room, if that makes sense. And that is one huge, huge factor that leads to the establishment of female rule in the 16th century. Okay, so we're going to move forward now that we've kind of thought about how we got there, how we started this tradition. Next, we're going to pick into another thing that's been a really huge factor for me in my own research, is thinking about king's consort. So when I was starting my PhD, again, it was all about the regnant queens of Navarre. And I was really, again, interested in female succession, female power, female rule, female authority. But as soon as I started looking at these queens, I realized, I read this really excellent piece by Teresa Ehrenfeit, a really excellent queenship scholar. And she was saying, actually, we need to think of kings and queens as a symbiotic pair. Monarchy needs both genders, and they both have this role, and they power share, and the power sharing dynamic's flexible. It can change. It can be 90-10 one way or the other. It can be 50-50, 60-40, but they have to work in harmony with one another. And we shouldn't separate kings from queens. We need to understand them together. And that rocked my world. And I started thinking about the role of the king consort, which was so vital in terms of understanding the regnant queens of Navarre. And it is also so vital in terms of understanding regnant queenship in Britain. So I once read a piece called The Queen's Marriage that kind of considered how difficult it is to find the right candidate, if you like, to be king consort. Being king consort is a difficult thing, as we'll get to in just a minute. And every choice that you make, whether you're going to look for someone internally or externally, whether you're going to look for someone with lands and titles or someone who isn't, they're all fraught choices. So what I'm going to do next is kind of work my way through the different situations of the regnant queens of Britain and see how they illustrate some of these dilemmas on how to choose the right kind of husband, if you like, for a regnant queen. So we're going to start with Mary. So, obviously she's our first regnant queen, as we were just talking about. Now, one of the big issues of Mary's reign was her decision to marry Philip of Spain. And this is really important to remember, that Philip was King of England as well. He was king consort, the crown matrimonial, but he was King of England. And obviously even the idea that she might choose him kind of in some ways triggered Wyatt's rebellion. There was this huge concern at the time. Obviously religion was part of it, but also the fact that at this time, Charles V, Philip's father, was the most powerful man in Europe. He had an empire that spanned Europe, but also was ever kind of growing globally. And at that point, England was a minor player, and there was a real concern that England would be swallowed up by the Habsburg Empire, the Catholic Habsburg Empire. Real concern over that. And so that really articulates this idea here. I'm not going to read the whole quote because you have it on the screen, but Claude de Cecil in his Monarchy of France, when he's kind of talking about why you don't want a regnant queen, is he's talking about the issue that if she marries a foreigner, effectively, a foreigner will always put his own country first. He will bring in foreigners. You will end up with foreign rule by the back door. It's like being conquered, but through marriage, effectively. And this was the real concern that there was with Philip of Spain. And of course, part of the issue at this time, there was a situation going on across Europe called the so-called Italian Wars, but it was a prolonged kind of slanging match, effectively between France and Spain, effectively between the Habsburgs and the Valois, and it was being fought out primarily in the Italian peninsula, but also in the Low Countries. And Mary, there was a real concern about England being dragged into it. And of course, Mary did lose Calais as part of this battle, this conflict, when it kind of opened up a theater in the Low Countries. It led to the English getting involved and losing Calais. And of course, she apparently said, when I die, you shall find Calais engraved upon my heart. This is exactly the danger of marrying the foreigner. So that's one illustration, if you like. Now, Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, if we think of Philip of Spain being the external match, the match with the foreigner, Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots also faced opposition to internal matches. So another Frenchman, Jean Baudin, in his 6 books of the Commonwealth, also argued against. Of course, here's 2 Frenchmen arguing against female succession. Salic law, it's part of the French tradition, which I can unpick later. That's another lecture. But again, he says, and again, another reason why you don't want female rule is that she has to marry either a subject or a foreigner. We've already talked about the issue of marrying a foreigner, but basically he says if she marries a subject, she's making someone king who should not be king, who is not born to rule, who is not worthy, if you like. She's raising someone up to be king. He's not supposed to be king. And that is going to make all the other nobles jealous. So Mary, Queen of Scots, her 3rd marriage was to Bothwell. And obviously the marriage to Bothwell in many ways triggered her downfall. Now, there has been much debate, both in academia and in popular culture, over whether or not Bothwell was Mary's great love, whether or not she was bullied into that marriage, whether or not she was even raped or coerced into that marriage. But whatever the case is, it was her downfall. Now, Darnley was the other issue. We'll get on to Darnley in just a second. But Bothwell obviously was the nail in the coffin. There was great opposition. Elizabeth, apparently, again, this is another big debate, whether how serious she was about marrying Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. But again, her great childhood companion, her dear close favorite. Again, there was much concern about the possibility of her marrying Dudley and making him King of England. Now, she ultimately backed away from that, particularly after the scandal around the death of his first wife, Amy Robsart. But again, it showed the opposition, the faction within the court, those who opposed the rise of Robert Dudley. Ooh. There we go. Now here is Darnley. We did say we'd talk about Darnley. So here's the other issue. If you marry internally, but within your own family. So again, not raising up a noble, but marrying someone within your own family. So there can be pros to that. If you marry someone within your own family, in theory, you are preventing that person from making a claim against you. So we talked about Elizabeth of York and Henry Tudor, how Henry had to marry Elizabeth to prevent her from making her own claim or her husband from making a claim on her behalf. We're going to talk more about William and Mary II. Now, obviously, William was the next closest male heir. If Mary II had not married William, and she had eventually come to the throne in another way, perhaps not usurping her father, as we'll talk about in just a moment, William could have contested her claim. So marrying them together made their claim stronger, and again, prevented William from making a potential claim and saying, well, I'm the next male heir, I should succeed. Now, the other option is to marry a cousin with no claims. So Princes Albert and Philip were both cousins of various degrees of their wives. And again, they did not have a direct claim on the throne, but it's marrying within the family. So again, you're marrying someone of at least in the kind of royal family rather than raising up someone from the nobility who doesn't deserve to be king. But it can also be a problem. So here's the situation of Mary, Queen of Scots and Lord Darnley. So Mary's other disastrous marriage, if you like. So in theory, part of the reason, the attraction of marrying Lord Darnley was that he too had a claim to the English throne, and their child, James VI and First, benefited from that. He was kind of doubly kind of inheriting their mutual claims, which made him almost an uncontestable in some ways, although it was much debated before he came to the throne, potential heir to Elizabeth, who had no children, obviously. But the issue was that Mary refused to give Darnley the crown matrimonial. He wanted to be king consort. He felt he deserved to be king consort. She wanted to kind of, keep him slightly beneath her, if you like. And that eventually led to a great falling out in their relationship. A kind of almost kind of counter coup on the part of Darnley eventually led to his murder, effectively, which Mary, Queen of Scots, was widely accused of. Really interesting parallels with another medieval queen, Giovanna I of Naples. Very similar situation with her and her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, which I can maybe go into later, but I don't want to get distracted right now. So, thinking about it a different way. So we've talked about kind of issues of marrying someone internal or external in your realm, internal in your family. But let's think about it in another way. Another choice to think about is, do you want someone at the same level as you? Now, if we talked about the problems of marrying down, if you like, of bringing, raising up a noble to be king, what if you look as a regnant queen for another king? Right? So obviously Mary I married Philip of Spain. Now, at the time they were married, his father was still alive. He had not yet abdicated, but he was made king of Sicily so that he was on a similar footing to Mary when they married. But we've talked about some of the issues of that. This issues of him being distracted, of course, as his father did abdicate and then eventually died. Philip inherited the Spanish lands, if you like, not the Holy Roman Empire, but the Low Countries, Spain, the global empire. It's obviously a huge distraction. So when you've got two sovereigns married to one another, what comes first? With William and Mary, again, what comes first? Being the stadtholder, being king. Again, this issue of a marriage of sovereigns, it can lead to a powerful union of states, or it can lead to distraction. So if this is an issue, what about going the other way around, looking for a prince with no lands of his own? And so we can see this becoming the model later on. So George of Denmark, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Again, all of them were men of royal family, of royal blood, but not, again, sovereigns in their own right. They weren't distracted, if you like, by their own lands and having to manage those or balance the needs of their country with that of their wife. So that's a model that comes in later. And we'll talk more about these more modern consorts in a second. So given all these problems, all these issues and potential downfalls with picking someone internal or external, someone with a title, etc., you could go down the route that Elizabeth did. Elizabeth basically decided, famously, she said, there shall be but one mistress here and no master. I even have a coaster in my office and on campus. I've got that as a coaster. I often kind of use that and think of her every day. So she decides to rule alone. But is she really alone? Because effectively what she does is she brings in Cecil as her partner in rule, Lord Burleigh. Again, she has control over him, though. In theory, she can always get rid of him. She is co-opting him. They are ruling in some ways as a partnership, but she has always got the leading hand, and she does because she is the sovereign, and there is no question of him being king in any way, shape, or form. So he is her assistant in rule, if you like. And she uses the possibility that she might marry as the key part of her foreign policy, even a long time after it becomes apparent that she's not going to. The idea that she could, again, is always her trump card. But there's a downside to this choice. We often think of Elizabeth as this great queen who made this great decision to rule on her own, and it did work for her. But the downside is she had no heir. And the worry about who her heir might be, would it be the Grey sisters? Would it be James of Scotland, etc.? this concern over the succession, her ill health. Again, you know, she had bouts of serious ill health. There was real concern about, you know, what would come next. This constant kind of question mark was a real issue at court. It meant she had no ally. You know, if she married someone, if she'd married into France and Spain, she would have had a very powerful ally. She had neither. And, you know, there is a downside. It's not a perfect strategy. It did work for her, but it had its issues. So one of the issues here, one of the big problems in terms of this choice is the ultimate question of wife or queen. And it's this issue of the queen's two bodies. Now, we often talk about this theory, Kantorowicz's kind of classic work that talks about the king's two bodies, the body natural and the body politic. And so this idea that the king is dead, long live the king, is this idea that the body politic, the office never dies. And the office is filled by the body natural. And the body natural can be male or female, old or young, etc. It's subject to disease, frailty, etc. But if the body natural is a woman and she's married, there's this constant dilemma, because in the patriarchal framework of pre-modern society, the idea was that the man was the head of the household, the head of the family, the head of the woman. But then if the queen is the head of the country, how does that work? When is she on top? When is she subservient? Who, you know, how does that work? And who is wearing the trousers effectively? And so part of this is the importance of prenups effectively. It's important to clarify the role of the consort, which is what we'll get onto in just a second, limiting or making it clear what is his role, what is his powers, what can he do, what can he not do? And so again, Mary's twin act concerning regal power, which defined her role as the sovereign, and the matrimonial treaty between herself and Philip, which defined his role and his prerogatives and his powers as king consort, were absolutely vital, again, to kind of getting that balance right, because that was the concern, that as wife, she would be subservient to Philip, and then Spain would be subservient to England. So here's the issue. Now, obviously, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, he, you know, famously said, you know, am I an amoeba? Because, you know, they decided to, you know, call it the House of Windsor. They did not take his name. His name did not become, it wasn't the House of Mountbatten, etc. It was, you know, again, he felt like it denigrated his role. He struggled at times to figure out what his role was early on. And he's not alone. It has always been a difficult role for a male consort, because the consort is usually female. And a lot of our expectations around the consort's role was about being a helpmeet, being a mother as well, this maternal role. When you're a man, how do you make that work? How do you define or redefine that role for a male holder, if you like? And so there are some issues here. So we need to think about the 5 kind of consorts that we had. Obviously, Elizabeth not married. So again, looking at the early ones, they were king consorts. I mean, Philip of Spain, as I said, was king of England. That was one of his titles. It was the crown matrimonial. He was king consort, but he was still King Philip of England, if you like. Now, obviously, William of Orange was in a very interesting situation, because that was the dual monarchy, where he and Mary II were both sovereign. Neither was consort. Very unusual situation, which reflected 2 things. One, the Glorious Revolution, which I'll talk more about in just a second. And secondly, again, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that William was the next male heir, and he had a right to the throne, a very strong right to the throne himself. So again, making them the dual monarchy, making them both sovereign, and neither consort was the solution to that. So we started with king's consort. But again, we ended up with Prince Philip. And so very often I had to kind of explain, you know, in media or in lectures, kind of how that happened. And it's really George of Denmark that we have to thank, blame, etc. for that shift. So when Queen Anne came to the throne, we were in a different situation. The dual monarchy, that had kind of gone away. George of Denmark did not have a right to the throne. He wasn't a ruler like William of Orange was, a stadtholder. And he was a man who was quite shy, had quite ill health, did not really want to be king consort, and did not really want him to be king consort. Parliament did not want him to be king consort. So the solution was redefining the role, that he said, I am happy to be my wife's subject. I'm happy to take that step behind. I'm happy to be Prince George of Denmark and not be king consort. And that was a key watershed, because that set a new precedent. So we talked about the importance of precedent in establishing female rule. This establishes a new precedent of the prince consort. When we get to Victoria, you know, the idea of giving Albert the crown matrimonial, Lord M says that's a non-starter. That's never going to get through Parliament. That's not going to happen. In fact, it took a long time to even give him the formal role of prince consort, that formal title. And this again shows that pattern had been set. And again, Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, there was no question of him having the crown matrimonial as far as Parliament was concerned. This was now, at this point, felt like a long-standing precedent, even though only one individual had kind of made that shift. And then, of course, when we get to the role of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, again, you know, Albert, again, as a very successful prince consort, had again established that role, and that it was, you had a regnant queen, and then one step behind her was her husband. But that one step behind, again, very difficult. And each of these consorts have found a way to define their role. For George of Denmark, he was really happy with, he wanted the titles of being admiral, he wanted military recognition. He didn't want to actually go out and fight, but he liked the uniform, he liked the titles. That's what made him happy. As we all know, Prince Albert put his energies into the Great Exhibition, put his energies into the projects that he was really passionate about, left a huge mark and impact on the monarchy, as we'll talk about in a second, but also, again, on London, on England, etc., through the projects and his passions. And of course, so did the Duke of Edinburgh. The Duke of Edinburgh Award, his charitable contributions, his work. Again, he was not only Queen's helpmeet, but he redefined the role once again for the modern era, as we'll talk about at the end. Apologies. Technology is not cooperating with me. There we go. Okay. So creating a constitutional monarchy. So I'm just briefly going to talk about the two Stuart Queens, because again, they are often piggy in the middle. We think a lot about Mary and Elizabeth, and even Lady Jane Grey. We think a lot about Victoria and of course Elizabeth II, but it is the two Stuart Queens who are really pivotal in this great shift in the British monarchy, creating the constitutional monarchy, which is the monarchy that we have today. So Mary II, she is the catalyst, if you like, in the Glorious Revolution. And Mary II all too often has been the most forgotten of the regnant queens. And she has always been, it's been William and Mary, the dual monarchy, but more William than Mary. Now, at the moment, I have a PhD student who is a collaborative doctoral partnership student with myself and Historic Royal Palaces, and her project is on the identity, the changing identity of Mary II. And what's really fascinating about Mary is she starts off as a Stuart princess, a potential heir. Then she becomes Princess of Orange. She becomes a consort, if you like, on the continent, a Dutch consort. Then she comes back to England as a regnant queen. And she has to keep reshaping and remolding herself into each of these roles. And that's one of the things that my student is looking at. She's doing some amazing work on kind of unpicking and understanding the shifting identity of Mary II and how vital Mary was in terms of redefining the British monarchy. So the Glorious Revolution, the idea to offer the crown to William and Mary, the overthrow of James II and Mary of Modena, these Catholic monarchs, if you like, creates this new situation. But because the crown is offered to William and Mary, it shifts the balance of power in favor of Parliament, who can kind of set the rules with the Bill of Rights on how the monarchy will function. And again, this is the beginning of constitutional monarchy. Now, Mary II, part of the reason why she's often been overlooked is it has been kind of considered that she was decorative, fluffy. Yes, she built Kensington Palace, or she reshaped Kensington Palace, she reshaped Hampton Court, the gardens. Yes, she collected a lot of porcelain. It's been seen as kind of fluffy and lightweight. William was doing the work and she was doing the decoration. But actually, it is Mary who, at a time when the monarchy was in a great deal of jeopardy, again, think about this, we've had the regicide, the restoration, things were still a bit shaky, then we've had the Glorious Revolution. Mary is the one who is doing that groundwork, laying the foundation, trying to rebuild monarchy, rebuild monarchy's image at a time when they were on tenterhooks. Things could have gone very badly. The whole thing could have collapsed under them. There were many who were either uncertain or frankly opposed to William and Mary. And the work that she did was reshaping the monarchy, setting a new frame for it, renovating its image and building it up and making William and Mary this kind of British Protestant fantastic couple, not just usurpers from the Netherlands, if you like. So she played a really key role, and that's only now just really being understood. Now, her sister inherits, sadly, Mary II dies quite young of smallpox, and it is ultimately her sister, Queen Anne, who comes to the throne. Now, Queen Anne has actually been getting a lot more attention recently, both in academia and obviously in popular culture with the Oscar award-winning film, The Favourite, which came out a few years ago. Now, Queen Anne used to be thought of as dull and boring and kind of a bystander to the events of her reign, the important events of her reign, dominated by the War of the Spanish Succession and Queen Anne's War globally. Now, this was a really important time, but now she's actually being seen in a very different way. James Anderson Wynn's fantastic book on Anne as patroness, it's this massive kind of tome, if you like, has really reassessed her role as a cultural patron, really reassessed her role as this vital pivot point that was balancing all these factions at court, the tumultuous politics, the factionalism, even between her favorites, etc., that she was the pivot point. She was holding it all together. She was, you know, again, this great survivor, that she was having to deal with the Jacobite threat. She was having to deal with the issue of the Hanoverians, who were very keen to come to England to kind of make their presence felt as these potential heirs. And she was very wary of the so-called rising sun phenomenon, where heirs become a kind of a court for those who are disaffected with the current regime to kind of coalesce around, which obviously became a real hallmark of the Hanoverians when they did come to power. Witness the, George 1, 2, 3, etc., and their sons and the courts of their sons. So again, she was having to kind of keep all these people at bay, balance everything at court. Her own physical health, her mental health was very poor. Her husband dies halfway through. They're very close. Obviously, there's been a lot made of the 17 pregnancies and the tragedy of her many stillbirths. Her son, the Duke of Gloucester, dying very young. So again, we're seeing her in a very different light now, not seeing her as dull and boring and disengaged, but actually, again, as this vital pivot point whose reign actually is a really kind of key moment in establishing Europe, Britain as a great power in Europe, and again, the empire as well. And then finally, we're going to move into the modern monarchy and the role that Victoria and Elizabeth II have played in developing and shaping the modern monarchy, these two very long-reigning female monarchs who really set their stamp on the modern era. So Victoria obviously was all about rebuilding the monarchy. Her predecessors, the Hanoverians, again, her immediate predecessors, in particular, her uncle George IV, the antics, if you like, of her many uncles and their mistresses, their illegitimate children, the issues over George IV's disastrous marriage to Caroline of Brunswick, the tragic death of Charlotte, Princess of Wales. By the time Victoria comes to the throne, the monarchy has been kind of reeling from a succession of crises, and the public image of the monarchy is very poor. And Victoria rebuilds the monarchy in a completely new lens. So instead of the factionalism, the illegitimate children and the mistresses and the secret wives and all the kind of issues that came before her, she creates this new, clean, pure as driven snow, highly domesticated monarchy, or image of that, at least, with Albert. They rebuild the monarchy. They almost kind of whitewash over everything that came before and create the monarchy anew with their large family. And one of my colleagues has written this fantastic book about Victoria, calling her the first media monarch. Now, all monarchs have had to deal with those who write about them in some way, shape, or form. And obviously the popular press is going much earlier. There's been some great studies about the Hanoverians in the popular press. In fact, I have a PhD student currently working on the popular press in Charlotte of Wales, for example. But she is a real master of it. And the argument that my colleague makes from Exeter is that she she is mastering the developing media of the 19th century. The newspapers exist, but again, media is growing, it's burgeoning, and she really knows how to manipulate it and use it to her advantage to again build this new image of the monarchy, and in some ways making the image of the Victorian reign, if you like, it's so much associated with Victoria, both as wife and widow, and her family, again, front and center in that image, that domesticated image of Britain, almost Victoria as the ultimate kind of angel in the home, if you like, this kind of image of domestication that is we see so much with Victorian kind of gender ideals of the period. Now, she also, from her, from her many children, is able to use them in the way that monarchs often did, making matrimonial ties and alliances. And obviously, she's building on, for example, her predecessor, Maria Theresa of Austria, again, the work of kings and queens throughout the ages to use their children to make productive ties, and leads to a situation where she's called the grandmother of Europe. And of course, people have been writing about the impact of those familial ties on the politics of the late 19th and early 20th century, and of course, the First World War. Apologies. There we go. Okay, and then finally, we have Elizabeth II. So we're going to end where we started in thinking about Elizabeth II as the inheritor of this legacy. And in many ways, we can see her, I think one of the reasons why her reign was so successful and so impactful, if you like, is she was able to really get the role of the modern constitutional monarch right. She really understood where the boundaries were, what was the way to use soft power, the way to be influential, the way to use her image. And again, that idea of being the media monarch that we were talking about with Victoria, she took to like the next level, keeping pace with the modern press, the modern society, the modern media as it changed, but also getting that balance right between tradition and innovation. She really understood that monarchy needs to preserve that tradition. It needs to preserve the kind of mystique, if you like, the kind of the centuries of legacy that she was inheriting. But at the same time, if it stays fossilized, it becomes a relic. It becomes out of touch, out of date, a relic of the past that we need to get rid of and strip away. And so she understood how to get that balance right between retaining the traditions, building on those foundations, but keeping it moving and adjusting and adapting in order to remain in touch. Now, arguably, Charles III and his family are going even further and faster with that adaptation, and maybe perhaps risking jettisoning some of the traditional elements that kind of made Elizabeth II also very successful. But that's another discussion. But she was kind of the right person in the right place at the right time. And when she came to the throne, 1952, it was a difficult time for Britain, post-war Britain, rationing still going on. Again, the tragedy of losing her father, the king. But here she was, this beautiful young woman, this young mother. She was radiant. She was a pinup idol, effectively, in her day. And they felt protective of her and her gender and her youth and her enthusiasm. She really, was able in some ways to really smooth over that transition in post-war Britain, smooth over that transition from empire to Commonwealth, and again, really understood how to use, not abuse, the role that she had. And it is really Elizabeth's reign that we see the creation of the monarchy that we now know. And again, for better, for worse, again, there's, it has its supporters and its opponents, but the creation of what we, has been sometimes called the firm, this idea that the monarchy is a family business, if you like. And she has definitely, she was able to weather the many crises and storms. All monarchs, all reigns have to deal with crises, and it's how you respond to those challenges that define you as a monarch and as an individual. And I think Elizabeth, with the Annus Horribilis, with all of the challenges that came her way personally and for Britain in this very turbulent period of history that she oversaw during her reign, she was able to endure, she was able to adapt, and she was able to weather those storms. And again, really defined modern monarchy, again, in some part leading to the great kind of mourning that we just recently witnessed at her death. So to conclude, again, I'm hoping that this talk has really exemplified the importance of Britain's reigning queens. And again, when Elizabeth II came to the throne, Churchill really remarked how fortunate Britain had been in its reigning monarchs. And these women have left an indelible mark on Britain's history, both as monarchs and as matriarchs. We often see we talk about the Elizabethan eras, the Victorian eras. These women, in part, have really kind of had a legacy because they are tied to such vital moments in British history. Elizabeth I will be indelibly associated with the Spanish Armada, something that all school children are picking up at school, that I end up unpicking a little bit, actually, teaching queenship and also I teach the Golden Age of Spain. So I always getting my students to kind of flip it over and look at the Spanish Armada in a different way. But we still see Elizabeth as this, Elizabeth I, giving the Tilbury speech about having the heart and stomach of a king and a king of England too. And, again, she will be indelibly tied to this key moment where Britain kind of fought back and won against a great power. The Stuart Queens, again, how important they were to the Glorious Revolution. Queen Anne's reign saw the Act of Union that now has obviously become, once again, a bone of contention in terms of whether or not Scotland will effectively nullify the Act of Union. Victoria, obviously, her reign as queen and empress, again, at the kind of maybe height, we can debate that, but of Britain's empire, its global empire, she's indelibly associated with that, for better or for ill. And obviously the very long reigns has kind of also helped to kind of stamp them on whole eras of British history. I think as well, as we've seen, these women were also masters of image crafting. We've talked about Elizabeth I, her creation of Gloriana, this kind of myth of Gloriana, the way we still see her. We've talked about Victoria and Elizabeth II also being media monarchs, image crafting for themselves, for the monarchy. Mary II, we've talked about how vital her image crafting was in smoothing over the Glorious Revolution as well. So they all played a really important role in shaping not only their own image, but the image of the monarchy. And so again, they have become beloved matriarchs, again, whether they were actually dynastic progenitors who had many heirs like Victoria, even Elizabeth II, or they were those, again, if you look at Tudor and Stuart queens, none of them had surviving heirs, but yet they still cast themselves as mothers of the nation and were remembered as such, mothers and even grandmothers of the realm. So I will leave it there, and I'm very happy to take questions and talk further either now, or if you have questions later, I've left my email address there. I'm very happy to talk further with any of you anytime. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a wide-ranging and thought-provoking talk, and it's a pity you can't hear our applause. It's also a pity we can't talk over drinks as we should, but I'm sure that there will be questions. While people are still thinking and making up their minds, do you think that Walter Bagehot's idea that the Constitution really consisted of two elements, the efficient and the dignified, and the monarchy was to be the dignified element of the Constitution? Do you think this still holds water? And if so, what does this mean for the future of the monarchy?
Yeah, no, it's true. Actually, his ideas have been kind of brought back to the fore. And this idea of the Elizabeth II, I think, did exemplify that dignified element. And I think that was a lot of her trump card. People really respected her. And again, that was a huge part of her image crafting and how she presented herself, the way that she dressed, the way that she comported herself, the way that she was very stoic and kept mum, if you that stiff upper lip, if you like, that she kept. There has been a lot of discussion that her successors, who are promoting a new, more kind of open and accessible monarchy, is perhaps in some ways altering that idea of, I mean, certainly Prince Harry's, memoir, obviously we don't need to get into it too much here, but again, there has been a real discussion of whether or not where monarchy is heading is breaking down that idea of monarchy being the kind of dignified kind of public face, the kind of, the refined on the pedestal kind of element, to be the pedestals kind of crumbling beneath them, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. More questions. Yes, I can see a question in the chat. So why did Elizabeth II decide on the son's name and thus now the royal name, Charles, that is Charles III? The name has long been considered cursed for a British king.
Yes, this is true. It is something, it's funny, I do have a few students who do Stuart PhDs, as we've talked about, and obviously that is the kind of the last Charleses that we had, if you like. We had the regicide and the Restoration monarch. Now, actually, I'm quite a fan of Charles II, but there are some who kind of belittle him a bit and see him as the merry monarch and all his mistresses, etc., and El Gwyn and all that. I really I see him in a slightly different way as a very kind of savvy man who was able to restore and rebuild the monarchy when it was on very precarious footing. But yes, I mean, if that's our association, the failed king who was killed and the merry monarch who was kind of light and fluffy, if you like, it doesn't bode, it's a difficult kind of one to kind of follow on from. It was interesting. Obviously, Charles, you don't have to have the regnal name that is your birth name, and obviously some monarchs have not. I mean, Edward the eighth is a good example, or seventh is a good example of that. He chose to take the name Edward and not Albert. So, for example, so he could have, in theory, decided to be Henry IX or something like that. But again, he made the decision to kind of stick with his birth name and be Charles III. So it is interesting. Perhaps he decided he's going to renovate the name and create a new tradition of upstanding Charleses for the future. So the jury's still out there, but yes, it is. There is some interesting kind of connections to be made to past Charleses.
And I can see that Chris Hammond has raised his hand.
Yeah, hello, good evening, Ellie. Question, where would you put Camilla? Because she's been made queen, so where does that fit in? And then a second question, you mentioned that the Queen Elizabeth, there was a certain aura and a certain dignity there. And it seems that you like Charles III. Do you think that he's got that sort of distant dignity, the aura and the dignity that was perhaps created by never having an immediate reaction to circumstances?
Yes, no, great questions. Great questions. I've been asked so much about Camilla, from the time that the Queen, the late Queen, made her wishes known that Camilla should be Queen consort, because it had been kind of a live question. And I think for two reasons. One, there has been a lot of almost confusion. I've had to kind of go on a few radio shows and explain kind of what a Queen consort is, because we haven't had one since the Queen Mum. There's been this massive gap, this interregnal gap, if you like, where we haven't had a queen consort. Now, obviously, ironically, the word queen comes from this old English word quen, which literally means the king's wife. And this is part of the reason why we have all these adjectives like dowager queen and queen consort and regnant queen and queen regent, having to kind of explain the kind of way in which a woman the kind of position she has. But in theory, the default would be the queen consort, if you like. And I've had to explain to a lot of people that she's not queen like Queen Elizabeth was. She's a consort queen, and this is, again, we've had loads of them. We just haven't had one in quite some time. And again, obviously, most people's understanding of a consort has been the Duke of Edinburgh, which obviously, is so Camilla has an opportunity here to kind of redefine the role, because there has been such a break. The last time I think we had such a long break is when there's been a couple, one after the death of Henry VIII and Catherine Parr. Obviously, you've got this massive break until we get Anne of Denmark with James, when James becomes King of England, obviously. So there's no Queen Consort of England for a massive break there. And then with the Stuart Regnant Queens as well, we have a bit of a break. But this has been a similarly long break. And so it is an opportunity for her to kind of almost, restart and refresh that role. But there had been a question of whether or not she would be queen consort, if she would be princess consort, if you like, in the way that George of Denmark was, or Prince Albert, because she was Duchess of Cornwall and not Princess of Wales. And obviously a lot of that was about Princess Diana being the last holder of that title, it being uncomfortable for Camilla to be called that. So yes, it is interesting. And we're already seeing Camilla redefining the role, choosing to drop the ladies in waitings and have companions, for example. So she is already kind of reframing the role in the way that she wants it to be. So it's going to be interesting. So I hope that's addressed the Camilla issue. Now on Charles, again, I think the jury is still out on Charles. And again, he obviously benefited from the huge wave of sympathy, for the royal family on the death of the Queen, and obviously the mourning, the kind of collective mourning. It remains to be seen exactly how Charles will proceed. Obviously, he's had a difficult scenario to deal with, at the moment because of what's going on with Prince Harry and his memoir, etc. But he is choosing to take his mother's route of not responding. So they are not publicly, they're not getting into a slanging match in the press and this kind of thing. He is again using Elizabeth's tactics, if you like, of keeping mum, at least in publicly. So we shall see. I think it's still early days, and I think the coronation will be a really interesting moment to see how that is received and how that is handled. So yeah, watch this space, I think. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions? I can't see anyone raising their hand. I can't see any questions in the chat. And that can only mean one thing, that a rich talk is still being digested. While this is happening, let us put our hands together once again for our speaker. It has been brilliant. So thank you very, very much for, well, not physically being with us, but giving this talk. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. And again, very happy to follow up with anyone on email. Thank you so much. It's very lovely to be with you in Germany, even if virtually.
It has been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. Some housekeeping. Thanks again, dear Ellie, for this elaborate talk and an insight into royal affairs that have been not familiar with me. And thank you so much, Frau Dr. Kern, that you could arrange for being with us tonight in relation with the Dagmar Westberg University Prize. So let's look ahead. And we will have two events this year. With the Deutsche Hochstift at the Romantik Museum in Frankfurt, and it will be the first will be on February 28th. Dr. Charlotte Lee, Associate Professor of German at the University of Cambridge, Nimm den Schwung, Lyrik und Bewegung bei Klopstock, Hölderlin und Rilke. You will receive the invitation by in the course of the coming week. And then on March 23, it will be a hybrid event at the Frankfurt Press Club plus Zoom, because we are so pleased to have members and friends joining from all over the world. And if it is Malaysia, like tonight, Sinclair McKay, I still have to discuss the topic with him. And then on March the 28th, again at the Deutsche Hochstift, in cooperation with the Marbach Institute, the German literature, on celebrating the 400th anniversary of the first folio, Shakespeare, with a reading and with a renowned professor giving the key talk. And then you see, for the rest of the year, we will also have interesting events you will be invited to. And thanks for joining us again. I'm so pleased to see Chris Hammond again after a long pause, and that Christoph Heil took the time to chair tonight, member of the board. And I think I finish with the note from Nick Jeffcoat, our president. Dear Ellie, if I may, I have to leave now. Many thanks for a wonderful talk, scholarly, articulate, and entertaining indeed. Great combination. Thanks also to, well, Michael, Christoph, and to everybody who has zoomed in this evening, the first one in 2023. Best wishes, Nick, and best wishes on behalf of the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft. Come back again and stay with us. Thank you.